Welcome back for the second half of data and analytics. When we finished off, we were working with stakeholders, and now we'll move on to analyzing data. The step of collecting data was not discussed much here beyond the initial that it needs to be done. So here in analyzing data, one of the focuses considering what the purpose is of the analysis, and that is to measure the business value and the effectiveness of training initiatives. And there are 4 types of analyses to choose from, and those are to let you see different things: hindsight, insight, and foresight. So I'll talk about those in just a minute. What to do at this step is to use the analysis that will help you best identify the information that's useful for what you need to know. So choosing among those 4 types. Begin by plotting data or using pivot tables. Plotting the data can let you see correlations between different variables, and pivot tables can let you sort and filter by different variables, and that's just initial looks at the data. Identify what information is useful and determine initial conclusions, and avoid data analysis pitfalls. So you're making sure the classic things don't happen, and I'll talk about those in a minute as well. The 4 types of analyses that were discussed are these 4, and they were addressed further in one of the TD at Work, the one Fuel Business Strategies with L&D Insights. And these were divided between descriptive analysis being the most common one that happens, and this being looking at hindsight, so what has happened. Diagnostic, moving up more into revealing some insights, why something happened. And then the last 2, looking more into foresight, looking ahead. Predictive analytics, measuring what will happen, and prescriptive, looking at how to make something happen. And in that particular article, they referred to AI as being one of the useful tools in those last 2. These are the classic data analysis pitfalls, and I won't read through all of them. You can pause it if you want to look at them more closely, but I will highlight the first one of starting with a conclusion or jumping to conclusions because of the risk of it influencing the way that you look at the data. And the last one of hypothesis testing without accounting for the Hawthorne effect of observers or the placebo effect. So being aware that your participants may act differently if they're being observed, or the placebo effect that if they think something has happened, then they may report that it happened even if nothing has actually been different. At the interpretation stage, where you're ready to interpret the results, you have your data, you have the variables isolated, you've maybe plotted them, and now you're ready to use those to determine the best course of action, to guide recommendations, and you will report those. There are 4 considerations for determining if the conclusions that you've reached are legitimate and useful, and we'll talk about those next. But first, looking at what do you do in this stage. To reach those interpretations, refer to that original plan and purpose. So you're returning to the stakeholders. What did you plan with them? What was the purpose of this analytics project and gathering the data and interpreting it? Gather and review the simple number details, and you probably have this from the analysis stage, but return to that. What was the sample size? What was the response rate? Such as if you had conducted a survey, how many people was it sent to and how many responded? And just those number of responses. How many people do you have responses for? Also, some of the number details, the mean or the average. What is the range, the minimum and the maximum? What's the standard deviation? And then lastly, their suggestion is to start with the quantitative data first, so you have your numbers, and then fill that in, then look at the qualitative data and use that as context to shed further light on what the numbers actually mean. In order to review and consider whether the conclusions that you have reached at this stage, that they are legitimate and useful, these are some questions that were brought up in the TDBOK, and I won't read through them, but I will highlight the issue of looking at how likely it is that these conclusions are beneficial, and that relates, I see, to the second one of returning to that original research question. And I'll point out the last one as well, of considering any objections that someone might have to the data and whether those objections have been addressed. The last step is to tell the story. So you have the data, you have the interpretations, and now you'll be conveying that to the stakeholders. What to know about that? The data should be presented in alignment with the stakeholder needs. So this is where it comes back to being aware of what the stakeholders care about, want to know, and need to know. Two things are important when presenting the data: scaling and integrity, because that's what shows the proportions and the relationships. And how data-driven an organization is affects their readiness to use the data in decision making, and I'll give a little bit more on that in a moment. The steps of what to do: define the outcome that the analysis is intended to influence. So come right back to the beginning. What is the outcome? What's the change that's intended to be provoked by this analysis? Choose the relationship to show. So is this a comparison? Is it one thing different than another? Or is it a distribution, that things are happening in one particular way? Then choose the tool that will help tell that story, and we'll look at some of the tools in just a minute. The more data-driven an organization is, the more likely they'll be ready to use the data for their decision making, and there's 5 factors that define a data-driven organization: a strong company culture, an experimentation mindset, and a tendency, a strategy of objectively learning from failures, a digital technology influence, a focus on the future, and are organizationally agile. And companies that are higher on those scales are considered more data-driven and more likely or ready, I won't say likely, I'll say ready, to use the data from the analytics project for decision making. What tools are available to show each relationship? If there's distribution of a single variable versus multiple variables, you can see here that there are different types of charts and maps and graphs that can be used, say versus a relationship or comparison or connection, or composition of the whole, or location. And that is where we'll end. So for an analytics project, it starts with beginning it and determining if the organization hasn't done analytics projects for talent development, then it might take a special selection of that project, working with the stakeholders, collecting and then analyzing the data, interpreting the results, and telling the story.